In war, it's easy to focus on the thunderous explosions, the moments that light up the sky and shake the earth. These are the images that dominate headlines and shape our memories of conflict. But what if the true turning points aren't the loudest or the most obvious? Sometimes, the biggest explosions start with the smallest sparks. A single ember, a flicker in the darkness, can set off a chain reaction that changes everything. In the chaos of battle, it's often the overlooked details, the quiet innovations, the subtle acts of courage that ignite the most dramatic consequences. On January 28, 2026, a cheap Ukrainian drone, carrying a warhead no bigger than a Christmas turkey, slipped through the shadows and triggered one of the most devastating blasts of the conflict. It wasn't a high-tech marvel or a billion-dollar weapon. It was simple, affordable, and most importantly, unexpected. Russia's so-called impenetrable Crimean fortress, a symbol of its military might, was shattered in an instant. Not by overwhelming force, but by clever thinking and off-the-shelf tech. The walls that had stood for years, believed to be unbreakable, crumbled before a weapon built in a garage. The explosion didn't just destroy ammunition. It sent shockwaves through the Russian command. It humiliated Russia, forcing its generals to abandon their grand plans for a southern offensive. The world watched as a superpower was brought to its knees, not by an army, but by a handful of innovators. This was a brutal lesson for every military strategist. In modern warfare, ingenuity trumps brute strength. The battlefield is no longer just about numbers or firepower. It's about adaptability, creativity, and the courage to try something new. The world was about to witness how a handful of determined minds, working in the shadows, could outsmart a superpower and change the course of history forever. To truly grasp the scale of Ukraine's achievement, we first need to understand the immense significance of what was at stake. This is not just a story of a single strike or a single depot. It's about a critical node in Russia's entire southern war machine, a place whose destruction would send shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. The Solad Kavadne depot wasn't just another military installation tucked away in the countryside. It was a fortress of firepower, a sprawling complex that played a pivotal role in Russia's campaign to control southern Ukraine. Its location was carefully chosen, deep behind Russian lines, and its perimeter was heavily guarded, making it seem untouchable. This facility was far more than a simple warehouse. It was the logistical heart and lifeblood of Russia's southern war effort. Day and night, convoys of supply trucks streamed in and out, delivering and distributing the ammunition that fueled the fighting in Crimea and Zaporizhia. At its peak, Solad Kavadne funneled up to half of all munitions destined for these critical fronts. Inside, the scale was staggering. Over 2 million pounds of explosives and ammunition were stockpiled in vast bunkers and warehouses. This made Solad Kavadne not only the largest depot in the region, but arguably the most dangerous warehouse on the planet. The sheer volume of firepower stored here was enough to sustain months of intense combat, or if destroyed, to unleash devastation on an unimaginable scale. For Russian generals, Solad Kavadne was more than a supply point. It was their insurance policy, their guarantee of victory. They believed that with such a massive reserve safely behind their lines, they could launch and sustain a massive offensive whenever the order came. The depot was a symbol of Russian military might and planning, a fortress they thought was beyond the reach of Ukrainian forces. But by concentrating so much firepower in one location, the Russians had unwittingly created a single catastrophic point of failure. All it would take was one successful strike to turn their greatest asset into their most devastating liability. The risk was enormous, but the Russians gambled that their defenses would hold. If Solad Kavadne were to fall, the consequences would be immediate and severe. Russia's entire southern offensive would grind to a halt before it even began, as frontline troops found themselves starved of ammunition and supplies. The collapse of this single depot could unravel months of planning and preparation in an instant. In essence, Russia had put all its eggs in one very explosive basket. Ukraine saw the opportunity and prepared to strike at the heart of Russia's southern war machine. The Russians weren't careless. They turned Solad Kavadne into a fortress bristling with sensors, radars, anti-aircraft guns, and powerful electronic warfare systems. They believed their technology made the depot untouchable. Any missile would be intercepted, any drone would be jammed. This overconfidence bred complacency. They assumed no one could breach their defenses, but they forgot the most dangerous enemy, human ingenuity. Ukraine wasn't going to play by the rules. The fortress's real weakness wasn't in its walls, but in the arrogance of those who built them. While Russia rested easy, Ukraine watched patiently, relentlessly for 12 days. Satellites mapped every inch, drones tracked routines, and operatives on the ground risked everything to gather details. They learned the depot's layout, its blind spots, and the complacency of its guards. Human intelligence turned satellite images into a living, breathing target profile. Ukraine knew exactly what was inside, how it was defended, and, crucially, that the Russians believed they were safe. The trap was nearly set. The defenders were asleep, and the attackers knew every crack in the armor. The stage was set for a strike. Exploiting a weakness is harder than spotting it. Ukraine didn't attack head-on. Instead, they launched a masterful deception. Fake signals and phantom troop movements convinced Russia a major attack was coming elsewhere. Panicked, Russian commanders stripped Crimea of elite units and air defenses, sending them to the wrong front. The fortress was left exposed, its best defenders gone. Ukraine had created a window of vulnerability. The Russians were looking the wrong way. The real attack was about to begin. With Russian defenses distracted, Ukraine launched a two-phase assault. First, 5 decoy drones flew directly at the depot, drawing fire and forcing Russia to waste precious interceptor missiles. The defenders, thinking they'd repelled the attack, relaxed. But the real weapon, a nimble FPV drone, was already on its way. Guided not by radio but by a hair-thin fiber optic cable, it was immune to jamming. The decoys had blinded and exhausted the defenders. The Stinger slipped through, unseen and unstoppable. Russia's high-tech shield was useless against this simple, ingenious approach. The final act was underway. The fate of the depot hung on a single silent flight. The drone operator miles away flew low and silent, hugging the terrain to avoid radar. Winds buffeted the tiny craft, but the operator's skill kept it on course. Past the outer defenses, the drone skimmed over the final fence. The operator picked the perfect target. A truck parked beside a mountain of ammunition crates. With a final adjustment, the drone dove. No computers, no lasers. Just human hands guiding a warhead to its mark. The video feed cut out as the drone struck. The spark had reached the powder keg. The initial explosion was small, just enough to ignite the truck, a flicker of orange against the darkness. For a moment, it seemed like a minor incident, a routine hazard in a war zone. But beneath the surface, a chain reaction had already begun, one that would soon unleash unimaginable destruction. The flames quickly spread to the stacked munitions, each shell and rocket feeding the growing inferno. Then, in an instant, 2 million pounds of explosives detonated in a single earth-shattering moment. The night sky turned to day as a fireball erupted, visible for miles around, shaking the ground and shattering windows in distant villages. The blast vaporized the depot, flattening everything for miles in every direction. Concrete bunkers, steel doors, and armored vehicles were reduced to twisted wreckage. The shockwave leveled buildings, uprooted trees, and left a scar on the landscape that would be visible for years. In the aftermath, a massive crater smoldered where the depot once stood. Burned-out equipment and scattered debris littered the ground. Emergency crews rushed in, but there was little they could do. 6 elite Russian soldiers died instantly, caught in the heart of the blast. The once imposing fortress was gone, reduced to rubble and ash in a matter of seconds. What had been a symbol of Russian strength was now a haunting ruin. But the real blow was strategic. Russia's entire southern offensive was crippled in a single night. Supply lines were severed, ammunition reserves obliterated, and artillery batteries fell silent, unable to fire another shot. The battlefield was eerily quiet. Abandoned trucks and shattered artillery pieces stood as silent witnesses to the devastation. Russian forces, once confident and aggressive, now found themselves cut off and vulnerable. The psychological shock rippled through the Kremlin. Military leaders and government officials stared in disbelief at the scale of the loss, struggling to comprehend how such a disaster could have happened. On the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers celebrated. News of the strike spread quickly, lifting morale and inspiring hope. Ukraine hadn't just destroyed a depot, they'd changed the course of the war, proving that ingenuity and courage could overcome overwhelming odds. The cost of this operation, not a fleet of jets or a barrage of missiles, but a single cheap drone, an off-the-shelf UAV modified for a daring mission, and a brilliant plan executed with precision. The world watched, stunned, as the balance of power shifted in a single, thunderous moment. The destruction of Solad Kavadne is more than a war story. It's a lesson in modern conflict. Brute force and massive arsenals are no longer guarantees of victory. Ingenuity, intelligence, and cheap adaptable tech now rule the battlefield. Ukraine's operation proved that centralized stockpiles are liabilities, not strengths. The future belongs to agile, creative forces who exploit their enemies' arrogance. In this new era, brains beat brawn, and a single spark can change everything. The rules of war have been rewritten,